Members of the jury, if you have any questions, we are open to that at the moment.
Thank you very much for all the presenters. My first question is for Ramzi and Wadia. What recommendations you would give the issues addressed, particularly resistance, armed resistance, self-defense, not only with respect to Gaza and the West Bank, but also with respect to Lebanon and Syria, where you have an Israeli aggression all over the place. And then I have a question for Jack on the US legal system. You mentioned a few examples in Europe, Latin America. Are there any particular impediments when it comes to the US legal system that you can't overcome, or we only have naming and shaming? In other words, is there a statute or jurisdictional problems with that to prosecute or to bring in other charges? Since usually federal courts defer to the executive branch, but are there certain laws that we can use? And do you have a list of these countries, which countries are easier than others that we can have as recommendations? On the other question, which has to do with the overall strategic goal of resistance. In 1937, Ben Gurion gave a speech in New York when he was asked what would constitute a win for the Zionist movement. He had an interesting answer in which he says, when we change the paradigm from being a Jewish problem into an Arab problem. So today we talk about the Palestinian problem. In his mind, that would have been the win. And I think we need a shifting paradigm, and that's the essence of my question. Should we talk about the Israeli problem rather than a Palestinian problem? And with that, then the strategic goal would be the dismantlement of the Zionist structures, because there is an Israeli problem. Do you agree with that statement? And do you see the question of liberation versus dismantlement or dismantling Zionist structures as one of the same, or are they different? Thank you. That
Thank
goes
you
for
very
all
much.
panelists, whoever would like to answer that.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Wadia, yes, you can approach. And I'm calling for Mr. Ramzi if he's around to come to us, because we have a question for him.
Thank you for the question. I think to the extent that your question calls for, Dr. Sami, your question calls for, strategic analysis or something about how resistance movements operate, I don't think I'm in a position to answer. But I do think that what we've seen, especially with the Israeli and American, unfortunately they always seem to go together, reaction to the ICC warrants in particular, the level of kind of out of control response of, sanctioning the judges on the court, sanctioning the prosecutor, it shows that that has struck a nerve, right? So there is value, in a kind of a global picture, there is value on returning to international law, even with all its drawbacks and limitations and Eurocentric focus. There is, I think, value in insisting on those aspects of international law that recognize Palestinian rights, including a right to resistance, right, to pressing them. And I think, obviously Lebanon has its own problems, Syria has its own problems, but if they were in a position to also make arguments along those lines, I don't think it is without merit or without value to basically structuring, I hate to use the word marketing, but to basically using it as a way to resist what you call the Israeli problem, right? I think it's important that even though we recognize all the drawbacks of international law, we still take what it can give us as a way to showing that the Israelis are the ones who are engaged in illegitimate action. So that's what I would say to that. Thank you.
Mr. Ramsey, I would like to ask you kindly to approach because we do have a question for you. Can you please just repeat the first question so Mr. Ramsey could hear it since he was not in the hall at the time?
Very well. I mean, in light of what you represented as resistance, armed resistance, self-defense, and so on and so forth, and that extends not just to West Bank and Gaza, but also to Syria and Lebanon, what would be your recommendations for these items? Not only for those who are the victims, but also for worldwide. What do you mean by, since resistance is not just one form, but all kinds of forms. So if you have any comments about practical things.
Absolutely. So the question is the recommendation to the jury or to the...
No, for us, because we have to give recommendations.
Right, absolutely. So I think one of the issues is that we approach the question of armed resistance, or we approach the question of resistance in this kind of ideological or political and culturally sensitive manner. Therefore, we kind of impose our own division of what resistance is on the Palestinians. And as a result, the Palestinians kind of have to respond to our own perception of what resistance is. The first recommendation is to try to understand al-muqawama, or resistance, from a Palestinian point of view. If you understand it from a Palestinian point of view, and where the Palestinian voice is going to be centered in offering an understanding of why Palestinians resist and under what circumstances and how and why, then this element of judgment that we usually cast on the Palestinians is going to disappear. Now we understand why they do it. Now, what method of resistance? Notice it's the Palestinian people themselves that determine that. 1987, for example, during the first Intifada, we threw rocks and we held protests and we carried out general strikes. That was a popular form of resistance. But then by the end of the Intifada, when the Palestinian voice was not enough to make the desired change internationally, you began seeing kind of the formation of various small cells of young people in Gaza, in the West Bank, and that was kind of the beginning of the return to armed resistance. So this is why this understanding is particularly important. The final thing is that the judgment on the Palestinians regarding the issue of resistance kind of changes the power dynamics. When you tell Palestinians, resist this way, fight this way, I can only legitimize you, accept you, embrace you even, or platform you, if you adhere to these sets of ideas and positions, then in doing so, you place yourself, not yourself, Dr. Sami, but that person himself, places himself in a power position that he is in a higher moral standards. And we have to be in a position of defending and explaining. I honestly think, and maybe this is going to get me in some kind of trouble, let's imagine a scenario in which the Palestinians did not resist. And I'm talking about all forms of resistance in Gaza. Those 2,000 Merkava and other military vehicles were not destroyed. Nobody talks about that, by the way, for some reason. That's more than any other Arab army since the beginning of this so-called conflict. That was done by the young people of Gaza. And these young people are part of the larger mass that is Gaza. They're not aliens, they are not foreigners, they are not invaders, they are not militants coming across borders, they are Gazans. Imagine if they did not resist. And if they did not send a message to Israel that no longer will firepower determine political outcomes. Imagine what would be in Gaza right now. Settlements will be everywhere. The beaches of Gaza will be now casinos, and Israeli soldiers will be wining and dining on the beaches of my refugee camp in Gaza. This happened, yes, because of the steadfastness of the people, yes, because of the sumud of the people, but also because of the resistance of the people in all of its manifestations, including armed resistance. So my recommendation is step back, try to understand resistance from a Palestinian point of view, do not cast a judgment, try to understand so that you develop a deeper and better relationship with how Palestinians choose to resist and why. Thank you.
I do call Jake now, Mr. Jake Brahm, to answer his question.
You're right to notice that the United States is a unique and difficult jurisdiction for our work, but it's not for lack of the legal tools. The United States does have universal jurisdiction codified into its laws. It has codified the Genocide Convention. There's a Clinton-era law passed in 1996 called the War Crimes Act. And what the War Crimes Act does is it establishes extraterritorial jurisdiction over war crimes, over grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions. And this is true of acts committed by US nationals abroad, but it's also true of grave breaches committed by anyone in the world, as long as they are physically present on US soil, which is basically the same as anywhere else. The difference, however, is that everything that, every charge under the War Crimes Act needs to be certified by the Attorney General. And it also requires some input from the Secretary of State. And there's certain factors that they have to weigh. And so, this always presents a problem because of the United States' position vis-a-vis Israel and, the concept of international law and war crimes in general. But particularly now, it's difficult. We are working on things in the United States. I'm not going to say what they are, but there's things happening. But we're not naive. We understand that Pam Bondi is likely not going to certify a war crimes charge against an Israeli soldier, especially as the United States continues to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity, both in complicity with Israel and also more recently against people in the Caribbean, right? But so there are still things that can be done that are different than name and shame in like a traditional human rights sense, which is to say we don't just publish the names of every soldier we have, right? We have a long list of people that we've been tracking, of people who have committed crimes, people who we're building files on, but we're not interested in doxing people. We're not interested in publishing names so that people can just know the names of the perpetrator. We're interested in doing legal filings. We're interested in charging these people with crimes with the idea that they will be held accountable. And of course, that is up to the prosecutors in each individual jurisdiction, because we're not a state. We can't arrest anyone. We can't even charge them. But what we can do is try to use the process of the law, the mechanisms of the law, and the law as it is written to highlight, one, the manifest criminality of Israel and the Israeli soldiers, to make make these issues like cognizable in a much more bite-sized, perhaps the wrong word, but bite-sized fashion for the public, which is often it's often difficult to think in structural terms, to think of, what can we do against a structure like Nakba, a structure like settler colonialism, against an entire entity like Israel. And there's heroic work being done in terms of arms embargoes, people militating for the severing of economic ties. But part of what a legal filing does, a war crimes charge does, is it puts a face to it. It makes the entire process of criminality easily understandable in the form of one person's actions. And indeed, like the entire mosaic of all of this criminality speaks to the nature of the state. And what it also does is it contains within it a kind of revolutionary demand that hides behind a discrete one, which is to say that if any country, and they will, I am so confident that they will, but if and when a country charges, arrests, prosecutes, and punishes an Israeli soldier for war crimes, that will signal the emergence of a new kind of international order, right? What we are asking states to do is, for the first time ever, really, apply international law to a powerful state while it is still in power. And if they are capable of doing that, and if and when they do that, that will introduce, really for the first time, rule of law on the international level, and it will start signaling to powerful states, not just Israel, but also the United States and others, that they can no longer get away with this because law is becoming operative and no one is above it anymore.
And for Mr. Juma, if you have heard clearly questions, I believe that your question was, should we discuss the Israeli question or the Israeli problem?
Yes, I agree. I think so. I think this is what has to be shifted, that Israel became the problem of the world, not just the Palestinians, the problem of the region, the problem of it seems that the problem of the United States as well. So the people all around the world is now talking about Israel as a criminal, as an apartheid, a genocidal state. So that's why it should be their problem. It's not the Palestinian problem. Palestinians are standing in their land, they are resisting, continue resisting, and they will not give up their land. So yeah, totally agree with that.